For centuries before central heating, winter sleep was not a matter of comfort. It was a matter of preservation. In farmhouses, military camps, frontier cabins, and stone cottages, nighttime temperatures could drop low enough to stiffen wash basins and frost interior walls. Yet families endured those conditions with a bedding method so consistent across cultures that it can only be described as deliberate engineering. Layered wool, structured weight, and tightly sealed edges formed a thermal system that, under the right conditions, can still outperform many modern comforters. The assumption today is that insulation has advanced beyond those older methods. Synthetic fills promise higher warmth ratings. Thick duvets suggest greater protection. But the historical record tells a different story. Civil War diaries, British military manuals, Scandinavian homestead accounts, and modern reenactment trials reveal that the effectiveness of old bedding was not accidental. It rested on an understanding, practical rather than theoretical, of heat transfer, air control, and moisture discipline. If electricity failed tonight and indoor temperatures fell toward freezing, the decisive factor would not be the brand of bedding available. It would be whether one understood the old system. The warmth mystery begins with how the past quietly outperformed the present. 19th century homes were often colder indoors than many modern unheated garages. Fireplaces heated rooms unevenly. Bedrooms were frequently unheated altogether. Yet letters and journals from soldiers in the American Civil War describe nights endured with little more than wool blankets, sometimes in drafty tents, without the level of incapacitating cold one might expect. Part of that resilience came from routine. Blankets were not simply thrown over the body. They were arranged with attention to order, material, and pressure. Quartermaster instructions emphasized wool as the base insulating fabric. Wool retained warmth even when slightly damp and trapped air effectively without collapsing under moderate weight. The mystery is not that people survived harsh winters. It's that they did so repeatedly across continents using a remarkably similar arrangement. You know, the modern illusion kind of confuses thickness with insulation. These days, modern bedding often prioritizes bulk. Thick comforters and plush duvets create the impression of superior warmth. Yet, insulation does not derive from thickness alone. It actually derives from the preservation of still air. When heavy modern bedding compresses its own fill, especially under the body, it reduces loft. Loft is the three-dimensional structure that traps air. Once compressed, insulation value drops sharply. This is why sleeping bags lose warmth when flattened underneath without a ground pad. Pre-modern bedding systems accounted for this intuitively. Instead of relying on a single heavy layer, they used multiple blankets. Each layer contributed trapped air. The layers were not pressed tightly together. They were allowed to retain loft. Weight, when added, was placed strategically rather than indiscriminately. Modern high-tech materials can perform well, but when misapplied, compressed, untucked, or layered improperly, they fail to deliver their theoretical warmth. The microclimate secret rested on three practical laws of heat. Before formal thermodynamics entered common education, households operated on principles learned through experience. The first law was to block conduction. Heat flows toward colder surfaces, and the ground beneath a bed or the floor under a pallet draws warmth continuously. Historical bedding prioritized underlayers. A folded wool blanket, straw mattress, feather tick, or pine bough base separated the body from the cold surface below. The second law was to control convection. Moving air strips heat from the body. Drafts entering at the sides of a bed degrade warmth rapidly. This is why tucking was essential. Edges were sealed to reduce air exchange, creating what might now be called a microclimate chamber. The third law was to manage moisture. Damp fabric conducts heat more readily than dry fabric. Wool's partial resistance to moisture gave it a consistent advantage. But, airing blankets daily remained standard practice in military and frontier settings. These laws were not articulated academically. They were enforced through habit. Historical records show that this method was treated as survival knowledge. British military manuals from the late 19th century included specific instructions about bedding arrangement in cold climates. Blankets were to be laid smoothly, doubled where necessary, and tucked tightly under mattresses or ground mats. The emphasis was not aesthetic, it was functional. Civil War soldiers wrote about sleeping warmer when blankets were folded beneath their hips and shoulders. Scandinavian frontier families layered wool beneath heavy woven coverlets and sometimes added bed curtains to enclose heat within a small sleeping chamber. In each case, the bed functioned as equipment. It was not decorative, it was protective. This understanding carried forward into 20th century conflicts. During World War I, trench manuals advised insulating from the ground first and reducing air gaps second. In World War II's Eastern Front campaigns, both German and Soviet forces relied heavily on layered wool and careful tucking to survive severe winters when heating fuel was scarce. So, the physics of cold explains why this actually worked. Conduction, convection, and radiation are the main ways our bodies lose heat. Conduction happens when your body touches a colder surface. Convection, on the other hand, occurs when air moves across your skin or sneaks through gaps in your insulation. And radiation, well, that just sends heat outward in all directions. The old blanket arrangement minimized conduction by doubling up insulation right under the pressure points. It also reduced convection by sealing the edges and limiting how much air could move in and out. Radiation losses were kept in check by trapping warmth inside several layers. What really made this system effective was the creation of a stable air pocket around the body. Once that pocket was warmed up, it didn't take much more effort to keep it that way. The body basically heated its own insulated chamber. Interestingly, modern bedding often overlooks this chamber principle. Loose edges and compressed layers let warm air escape and allow cold air to sneak in. The layering formula, well, it followed a pretty specific order. Traditionally, you'd start with a wool blanket folded lengthwise and placed right beneath the torso. In colder settings, a second layer would run the full length under the sleeper. On top of the body, a lighter wool blanket came first to help preserve loft. Then, a heavier quilt or coverlet was added, giving extra weight without squishing everything down too much. The key here was the sequence. Wool closest to the body made sure you stayed insulated, even if there was a bit of moisture. Heavier, more decorative layers stayed on top, adding stability and cutting down on drafts, but not serving as the main source of insulation. Cotton sheets were usually placed between the skin and the wool for comfort, but they weren't really counted on for warmth. Cotton loses its insulating power when it gets damp, so it was never the primary thermal barrier. This order really shows a deliberate prioritization of each material's properties. The tucking principle, you might say, created what could be called a thermal capsule. Tucking wasn't just about keeping things neat, it was about sealing the whole system. Blankets were tucked under the mattress or under the body along the sides, especially near the feet, since that's where heat loss speeds up. Around the shoulders, everything was drawn snug, but not so tight that it compressed the loft. This setup created a kind of semi-enclosed capsule. Inside that space, body heat would build up. Drafts were kept to a minimum. The system worked a lot like a modern mummy-style sleeping bag, though it was made from separate pieces. If you didn't tuck things properly, the whole arrangement could fall apart. Air sneaking in could undo the benefits of even multiple layers of insulation. Ground chill required adaptation, especially on iron beds and floors. Iron bed frames, common in the 19th and early 20th centuries, conducted cold effectively. In such cases, additional underlayers were essential. Straw ticks, feather mattresses, or folded blankets buffered the body from metal supports. On cabin floors or in military tents, pine boughs, hay, or spare clothing provided insulation from frozen ground. Soldiers were taught that a single blanket beneath was often more valuable than an additional blanket above. This principle remains central in modern survival training. Insulate beneath first, add loft above second. Modern testing has quietly confirmed the old system's effectiveness. Historical reenactors and cold weather survival instructors have conducted informal comparisons between layered wool systems and single modern comforters in unheated environments. When properly arranged, layered wool often maintains warmth longer and more evenly. The reason is structural. Multiple layers maintain air gaps even if one layer compresses. The system is redundant. If one component dampens slightly, others continue to function. Synthetic fibers can rival wool in laboratory conditions, but in variable real-world settings, especially where moisture and compression are factors, the layered method proves resilient. Emergency resilience begins with understanding arrangement, not equipment. If the electrical grid failed during a winter storm, indoor temperatures could fall rapidly. In such conditions, knowing how to construct an effective bedding system would matter more than owning a high-end comforter. The ancient method requires only wool blankets, attention to layering, and disciplined tucking. It does not depend on electricity or specialized materials. It relies on physics and structure. This knowledge once circulated widely because it had to. Comfort and convenience gradually displaced it. Rebuilding the ancient bed in a modern home is straightforward. A practical reconstruction begins with insulating the mattress or floor beneath. Add a folded wool blanket under the torso. Place a full-length wool blanket beneath if available. Lay a light wool blanket over the body, preserving loft. Add a heavier quilt above for weight and draft control. Tuck securely along the sides and foot. Ensure dry base clothing. The result will not resemble a modern-styled bed. It will resemble equipment assembled for purpose. The objective is not aesthetic harmony. It is thermal efficiency. The final lesson is that the bed was once a survival tool. Pre-modern households did not treat winter bedding casually. It was arranged with care because mistakes had consequences. Frostbite, illness, and diminished strength followed poorly managed cold exposure. The old blanket arrangement trick endured because it worked. It integrated material science, air control, and moisture management long before those terms were widely understood. It transformed the bed into a protective system. Comfort has distanced modern life from that awareness. Yet the principles remain unchanged. Heat still moves according to the same laws. Air still insulates when trapped. Moisture still undermines warmth. Remembering these practices is not an exercise in nostalgia. It is an acknowledgement that survival knowledge often hides in ordinary domestic routines. If you value serious, in-depth historical analysis that recovers practical lessons from the past, subscribe to Hidden in History. Share this documentary with others who appreciate careful examination over simplification. The quiet disciplines of history still matter, and sometimes they keep us warm.